Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. I still remember the first day I met him. I was in 7th grade, walking home from school the same way I always did. Down that quiet suburban street where every house looked about the same. Well-kept lawns, trimmed hedges, and flags waving in the breeze. My house stood out a bit more than the others, though. My mother loved everything red, white, and blue. Our curtains, our cushions, even the porch chairs were painted in those colors. She said it made her feel proud every time she came home. I guess that's why what he said to me that day stuck in my mind so sharply. It was too much of a coincidence, too strange to ignore. He lived 3 houses down, in one of those older homes that always seemed dim inside no matter how sunny it was outside. The paint on his siding was peeling, and the grass was uneven, patchy in spots, almost yellow. He was usually quiet, rarely came out, but sometimes I'd see him at the mailbox or watering his plants in the evening. Every time I passed by, he'd wave. I'd wave back because that's what you do, even though something about him made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he smiled, just a little too long, too fixed, like it didn't reach his eyes. He was probably in his early 40s, balding, always wearing plain shirts tucked into jeans, and those worn brown shoes that looked like they'd been his only pair for years. That afternoon, he was sitting out on a foldable lawn chair near the edge of his yard, like he'd been waiting for someone. When I got closer, he waved like usual, but this time he spoke. His voice was friendly but low, like he was trying not to sound too eager. He told me he was having a red, white, and blue sale in his backyard, that he had all kinds of patriotic things for sale, and that I should come check it out. I remember him gesturing toward the backyard like it was some kind of event. My stomach tightened. I didn't see any signs of a sale, no tables, no boxes, no setup. Just the same overgrown yard and a cracked driveway. I smiled and told him I needed to go home and get some money first. My voice came out a little shaky, but he didn't seem to notice. He nodded and told me to hurry because it might all be gone soon. That sentence made something in me twist. I walked off as casually as I could, but the second I turned the corner, I started walking faster. I didn't like the sound of it. Him having some kind of sale in his backyard with no one else around. It didn't make sense. He didn't seem like the kind of person who threw yard sales. And even though my mom loved anything patriotic, I knew better than to go into a stranger's backyard alone. I remember stopping at the end of the street, looking back. He was still sitting there watching me. Not waving anymore, not smiling, just staring. I turned again and headed straight for my neighbor's house, the one directly beside ours. Everyone in the neighborhood called him the tattoo guy, because both his arms were covered in prison tattoos, the kind you recognize even as a kid. He looked rough, built like someone who could throw a car if he wanted to. But my parents liked him. He'd changed his life around, and he was always kind to us, especially when my dad was out of town for work. I trusted him, and I think that's why my feet led me straight to his door. He answered right away, and even though I didn't have to say much, he seemed to understand that something wasn't right. I told him about the man and the sale, and I could tell from his face that he didn't like it either. He grabbed his keys and walked out with me without saying much. My heart was pounding the whole way there. I remember feeling both scared and safe. Scared because I had no idea what we'd find. Safe because I knew my neighbor wouldn't let anything happen to me. When we got to the man's house, he was still sitting in his front yard. But the second he saw my neighbor walking with me, his face changed. The smile came back, but it was different this time. Forced, nervous. My neighbor didn't waste any time. He just told the man we were there to see the sale. The man hesitated, then nodded and led us around to the backyard. The whole time I could feel this heavy silence, like even the air didn't want to move. And there it was, his red, white, and blue sale. A few old boxes, some random junk laid out on a small table, and scattered items that looked like leftovers from a thrift store. There were some faded flags, chipped mugs, a broken lamp painted red and blue, and a few shirts folded neatly on a chair. Nothing about it seemed organized or real. It didn't look like someone trying to sell things for money. It looked like a setup, something meant to lure someone in. My neighbor looked around for a while, just quietly taking it all in. He picked up a few things, nodded a little, and then told the man we'd come back later. I remember the way the man's eyes flicked between us, like he was trying to figure something out. He didn't say much, just smiled again and said we could come by any time. When we walked back, I didn't say anything, but I could tell my neighbor was tense. His jaw was tight and he kept glancing over his shoulder until we were out of sight. When we got back to our street, he told me to go home and stay there. I did. I went straight inside, locked the door, and sat by the window, staring down the road for what felt like an hour. I didn't see him again that day, or the next. But later that evening, my parents came home, and my mom told me from now on, I should walk home from school on the other side of the street. She didn't explain why, just said it in that firm tone she used when she'd already made up her mind. I didn't question it, but I remember the way she looked at me, like she knew something I didn't. After that, I hardly ever saw the man. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of him through his blinds or spot him putting out the trash at night, but he never waved again. His house always seemed darker, like something in it had shut down. The only thing that stayed the same was that strange feeling I'd get every time I passed by, like there was still something wrong inside that house. 2 years went by before I heard what happened. I was in 9th grade when my mom mentioned it one evening. She was talking to my dad about something she'd read online. My ears caught the man's name immediately. He'd been arrested for trying to lure a child into his house. The words made my stomach drop. I remember sitting there frozen, thinking about that day in his yard, the fake sale, the cheap junk, his fixed smile. I realized then what might have happened if I'd gone into his backyard alone that day. The thought made me sick. Years later, I reconnected with my old neighbor, the tattooed one, through Facebook. We talked about that day, and I finally asked him what happened after we left. He told me that as soon as I'd gone home, he called the police. He didn't like the setup, said it felt wrong, like the man was waiting for something to happen. The police apparently came by to check things out, but nothing ever came of it back then. My neighbor also told my parents about it afterward, which explained why they had me avoid that side of the street. He said he'd always had a bad feeling about that man, but you couldn't prove much unless he did something. Thinking back now, it still makes me uneasy how close that moment was to becoming something worse. I can still see the man's pale face, his empty smile, the way his eyes followed me like I was something he'd been waiting on. I've thought about it many times over the years, how easily I could have just gone along, walked to that backyard by myself out of curiosity or politeness. If I hadn't stopped to think, if I hadn't gone to my neighbor's house, who knows what would have happened? I didn't realize it then, but that single decision to tell someone to not go alone probably saved me. Even now as an adult, I sometimes find myself remembering that day whenever I see someone who gives me that same uneasy feeling. It's strange how moments like that stick to you. They don't fade with time. They just sit quietly in the back of your mind, waiting to remind you of how fragile safety can really be. The man's house stayed empty after his arrest. For a while, no one wanted to buy it. The grass grew taller, the paint peeled worse, and the whole place began to look like something out of a forgotten photograph. When I came back to visit my parents years later, the house was still there, but boarded up. The windows were sealed, and the for sale sign had rust on it. My mom said it had been like that for years. No one wanted to move into a house with that kind of history. Every time I walked by, I could still picture that lawn chair on the edge of the yard, the man's quiet, almost rehearsed smile, and his voice asking me to come see his red, white, and blue sale. It's strange how one sentence can live rent-free in your head forever. You should come check it out. At the time, it sounded harmless. Now it feels like something poisonous hiding behind a polite tone. I don't think about him often anymore. But every once in a while, when I pass a house with overgrown grass and half-closed blinds, that memory flickers back. I feel that same faint chill, The one that reminds you just how close danger can be to ordinary life. Sometimes sitting right there on the front lawn, smiling like a friend. When my wife and I first moved into that apartment complex, we thought we'd found a pretty good deal. The place was clean enough, rent was fair, and the neighbors seemed quiet. It wasn't anything fancy, but for the two of us just starting out, it was comfortable. The buildings were a pale tan color, built into a slope, so the bottom floor apartments were half underground. It gave the place a strange look. Some windows were almost level with the ground, like basement windows. The first few weeks went by without much issue. We'd get up early, go to work, come home in the evening, cook dinner, and watch a little TV before bed. It was normal life. It was about a month after we moved in that we noticed him. The guy we later started calling Creepy Guy. I don't remember his real name, and honestly, I don't think I ever knew it. He lived on the bottom floor across the courtyard from us. The first time I saw him was one morning as I was leaving for work. I shut the door behind me, keys in hand, and suddenly his door opened. It was quick, like he'd been standing right behind it, waiting. He leaned out just enough to look at me. His hair was thin and messy, the kind that looked greasy even when it wasn't, and his eyes were sunken in like he hadn't slept in a long time. He didn't say anything. He just stared until I got in my car and left. At first I brushed it off. Maybe he was just curious, I thought. Some people are like that, awkward, nosy, whatever. But over the next few days, it started to happen every morning. I'd open my door, and not 10 seconds later, his door would creak open. He'd step out in his worn-out slippers, squinting toward me, just standing there. Sometimes he'd step farther out into the courtyard and look up toward the parking lot, as if trying to see which car I drove. It got to the point where I'd wait by the window before leaving, just to test it. And sure enough, the moment I stepped out, I'd see his door open. It was unnerving. My wife noticed him too. She told me one evening that she'd seen him walking around the complex during the day. She worked from home, and her desk faced one of the ground-level windows. Apparently, he'd circle the building over and over again. Sometimes he'd stop to look at the bushes or pretend to check something on the walls, but mostly he just wandered. She said once he stopped right outside our window and stared at it for several seconds. The blinds were closed, but the thought of someone standing that close trying to see in made her skin crawl. We started keeping the blinds shut all the time after that. I hated it, honestly. It made the place feel dark and closed in, like we were living in a cave. But it was better than knowing that guy might be looking in. A few of the other residents mentioned him too. You'd see them at the mailboxes or out walking their dogs, talking in low voices. Everyone knew he was strange. There were stories about him being caught trying to open other people's doors. One guy from the far end of the building said he found his door slightly cracked one afternoon when he came home. And when he stepped inside, Creepy Guy was standing there in the hallway, pretending to look for his cat. The complex didn't allow pets. After that, people started locking their doors even when they were inside. You'd see windows covered with sheets or foil, anything to keep him from peeking in. Maintenance said they'd caught him sneaking into one of the empty apartments that was being cleaned out for a new tenant. When confronted, he claimed he was helping, though no one could explain what that meant. They made him leave, but that was it. No police, no real consequence. One night around midnight, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps outside our bedroom window. We were on the upper floor, so our windows were about level with the ground on that side. The sound wasn't heavy, more like slow shuffling in the gravel. I froze for a second, then got out of bed as quietly as I could. My wife stirred and whispered something, but I gestured for her to stay quiet. I moved to the window and pulled back the curtain just an inch. It was dark outside, the kind of darkness where you can't tell what you're seeing, just vague shapes. But I saw movement, someone standing close, almost pressed against the glass. I couldn't make out his face, but I could tell by the outline, the way he leaned slightly forward, that it was him. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. I dropped the curtain and stepped back, heart pounding so hard I could hear it. We stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening. Every creak or rustle sounded like someone outside. By morning, when the sun came up, I looked out again, but he was gone. I checked for footprints, and sure enough, there were faint impressions in the dirt near the window. After that, I started to feel constantly on edge. Every time I left for work, I looked over my shoulder. Every time my wife went outside, I told her to text me when she was back in the apartment. Things escalated slowly. It wasn't like one big event that made us realize how bad it had gotten. It was a series of small things that built up over time. Once I came home early from work and saw him crouched near one of the basement windows, peering inside. When he noticed me, he stood up quickly and shuffled off, pretending to look at the grass or something on the ground. I didn't say anything. I just went inside and locked the door. It felt like confronting him would only make it worse. My wife started to dread checking the mail. The mailboxes were in a small covered area near the center of the complex, surrounded by a few bushes and a bench. It wasn't far from our apartment, but you couldn't see it from our windows. One afternoon, she came back pale and quiet. I asked her what was wrong, and she told me he'd been there again. She said he'd followed her to the mailboxes, not walking directly behind her, but keeping his distance, just close enough that she could hear his footsteps. When she turned to come back, he turned too, following her all the way back to our building. She said he was wearing a thick, dark leather jacket, even though it was about 90 degrees outside. Sweat was pouring down his face, but he didn't seem to care. That was it for her. She reported it to the apartment management the same day. They said they already had a few complaints about him and were handling it. A few days later, we got word that they were going to evict him. Supposedly, he'd been warned before about trespassing and harassing tenants. The eviction notice went up on his door within the week. I remember walking past and seeing it taped there, flapping slightly in the breeze. I felt relieved but not safe, not yet. For the next several days, he became even stranger. He stopped wandering during the day and started pacing at night instead. You'd hear his heavy steps echoing through the courtyard after midnight, the sound of his shoes dragging across the gravel. Sometimes he muttered to himself, his voice carrying just enough that you could make out words like liars and thieves. A few times, I caught glimpses of him through the blinds, his head tilted down, shoulders stiff, his mouth moving as he talked to no one. One night I woke up to a loud thud outside. It was past 2 a.m. My wife woke too, clutching my arm. We listened. The sound came again, like something being kicked. I peeked through the blinds and saw him across the courtyard. He was standing near the office building, yelling under his breath. He was swinging his arms, slamming his fists against the wall. I saw something glint, keys maybe. I didn't move, just watched. He turned suddenly, looking toward our building, and for a split second, it felt like he was staring straight at our window. I froze. By morning, he was gone. The next day, management had maintenance come and change the locks on his apartment door. They said he had until the weekend to leave, but no one saw him move anything out. No truck, no boxes, just him still wandering around. On his final day, he was walking in circles near the parking lot, mumbling. A few of the maintenance guys were nearby, but they ignored him. Later that afternoon, his blinds were drawn tight, and his door stayed closed. That night, everything was quiet. It was the first time in a long while that I didn't hear footsteps or muttering outside. We went to bed early, exhausted from the constant stress. But around 3 in the morning, there was a sudden sharp knock at the door. Just once, my heart jumped. We didn't move for a few seconds, just listening. Nothing else followed. I got up slowly and went to the peephole. The hallway was empty. In the morning, when we left for work, there was something scratched into the paint near our door handle. It looked like a jagged line, maybe done with a key. I couldn't tell if it was supposed to mean anything, or if it was just his way of letting us know he'd been there. I told management, and they said he'd finally been escorted off the property earlier that day. The relief that followed wasn't instant. It took weeks before my wife felt comfortable opening the blinds again. For a while, we'd still catch ourselves listening for the sound of his door, waiting for it to creak open whenever we left. Eventually, we stopped hearing it. The complex started to feel normal again. People began to leave their windows uncovered. Kids played in the courtyard, and the air around the place felt lighter. A few months later, when we were packing to move to a better apartment across town, I ran into one of the maintenance guys. He mentioned that after Creepy Guy was evicted, they found his apartment nearly empty. Just a mattress on the floor, no sheets, a few empty cans, and piles of notebooks stacked along one wall. Apparently, the notebooks were filled with pages of messy handwriting, lists of apartment numbers, times of day, and random notes about who came and went. He'd been watching everyone. That stayed with me for a long time. Even after we moved, I found myself double-checking the locks every night, keeping the blinds closed after dark, and avoiding eye contact with neighbors for fear of recognizing that same vacant stare. I used to think creepy was just a word people threw around lightly. But once you've had someone like that circling your life, someone whose thoughts you can't read, whose intentions you'll never fully know, it changes the way you see the world. You realize how thin the line is between feeling safe and realizing someone's been watching you all along. When I was about 10 years old, a family moved into the house at the end of our street. It wasn't anything special to look at. An old semi-detached with faded blue paint that had peeled away in thin strips, exposing the rough wood underneath. But something about it always felt off. Even before the new family came, that house had a sort of stillness to it. The curtains were always drawn, the garden overgrown, and the windows seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. You know when a place looks like it's been forgotten? That's what it was like. But when the new family moved in, it didn't get better. It got weirder. The moving van came on a Wednesday morning during the summer holidays. I remember because I was sitting on the curb with my bike, watching, like most kids in the neighborhood would when something new happened. But this move was strange right from the start. The van driver unloaded everything himself. No one came out of the house to help. The front door opened a few times, just slightly, but whoever was inside never came out far enough to see their face. A hand would appear, pale and thin, to pull something inside, and then the door would shut again. No one said a word. Over the next few days, the house changed just a little. The lawn was cut, but not neatly. Just one pass through the middle, as if someone had given up halfway. The old rusted mailbox was replaced with a new one that had no name on it, only the house number. The curtains stayed shut even on the brightest days. We didn't see anyone come or go, not even to put out the bins. Somehow the garbage still disappeared every week. At first, the adults on the street didn't think much of it. People come and go all the time, but even they started to whisper after a while. Our street was the kind where everyone knew everyone, where neighbors said hello when you passed, and kids played football together in the evenings. The new family didn't fit that. They didn't wave, didn't walk their dog. Hell, they didn't even seem to have one. You could go weeks without any sign of life from that place except the faint flick of a curtain when someone walked by. The first time I saw one of them, it was late afternoon. I was walking home from my friend Sam's place, kicking a stone down the sidewalk, when I felt that prickly sensation of being watched. I looked up, and there was a small face peeking out from behind the curtain of the second-floor window. It was just for a second, a pale, wide-eyed face that vanished as soon as I noticed it. I remember standing there for a bit, trying to see if they'd look again, but they didn't. It left this strange feeling in my chest, like something cold pressing down from the inside. After that, I started paying more attention. Sometimes, when I rode my bike past the house, I'd see movement, a shadow near the door, the faint sound of footsteps inside. But the street was quiet enough that if anyone had opened a window or stepped out, you'd notice. The family never did. Halloween that year was when everything started to feel truly wrong. My friends and I had been planning our trick-or-treat route all week, trying to hit as many houses as possible before curfew. We decided stupidly to go to the strange house too. None of us had ever seen them outside, and we wanted to see if they'd even answer the door. Their front yard was dark, not a single pumpkin or decoration, just the soft sound of wind brushing through the uncut edges of grass. When we got to the door, we hesitated. There wasn't even a porch light. Sam dared me to knock, so I did. The sound echoed in a way that felt wrong, like it went deeper than it should have. We waited holding our candy bags, but nothing happened. Just as we were about to leave, there was a click. It wasn't the door, it was the letterbox. It opened, and behind it, 2 eyes stared out at us. No face, no words, just eyes. Not blinking, not moving. Everyone froze. After what felt like forever, the slot snapped shut again. We ran off without saying a thing. We didn't even joke about it. It was too strange. After that night, things felt heavier around that house. You'd walk by and feel like you shouldn't be looking at it. Like it was looking back. Even the air seemed different in front of it. Still cold, even in the middle of summer. A few weeks later, I was outside kicking my ball around when it rolled toward their front yard. Normally, I'd just run and grab it, but when it stopped near their steps, I froze. The curtain in the front window moved again, like someone was watching. I could barely see the outline of a small head. I waited for the person to disappear like before, but this time they didn't. They just stood there, still, the shape of their head visible through the fabric. I remember whispering, "Come on," to myself, running in, grabbing the ball and sprinting away so fast my chest hurt. When I looked back, the curtain was still slightly open. As weeks turned into months, the family didn't change. Nobody saw them leave for work or school. They didn't shop at the local store. They didn't talk to anyone. Their car, an old gray sedan, never moved. But you could tell they were still there. The curtains would shift sometimes at night, and the faint glow of a light would flicker on behind them. Always the same dull yellow color. Never a TV glow, never music, never laughter. Just that faint light. Then there were the sounds. Sometimes when I couldn't sleep, I'd look out my window toward their house. The street light hit their roof just enough to show the shape of the chimney. I'd hear tapping, faint rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking from inside the walls. I told myself it was just the wind, or pipes or something simple. But the rhythm was too steady, too deliberate. It came and went for months. The weirdest thing, though, was how nobody else seemed to really react. My parents mentioned the family once, saying it was odd they didn't join the block party that year. But that was it. Everyone just quietly accepted their presence. I don't know if it was because no one wanted to be rude, or because the whole situation made people uneasy enough that they didn't want to acknowledge it. One day near the end of summer, Sam and I were riding bikes around the block when we saw the front door open. Just a crack, like someone was peeking out. We slowed down, pretending not to notice. From that narrow opening, we could see a sliver of a person standing just behind the door. They didn't step out, didn't wave, just stood there, watching. We pedaled away fast, trying to act like it didn't bother us, but I couldn't stop thinking about it the whole night. A few months later, I moved away. My parents bought a place closer to where my dad worked, and we packed up in the middle of autumn. On the last day, I remember standing by my bedroom window looking at that house one final time. It looked the same as always, closed up, quiet, curtains drawn. But right before we left, I saw something move in the top window again. The curtain flicked, and a pale hand pressed against the glass for a moment before pulling back. I thought about that family for years after we left. Sometimes I'd wonder if they were just extremely private people, maybe scared of something, maybe sick. But then I started to think about all the little things that didn't make sense. The garbage that disappeared without anyone taking it out, the car that never moved, the steady tapping sounds at night, the letterbox eyes on Halloween, the faces that never showed fully. Years later, when I was in my 20s, I went back to visit my old neighborhood out of curiosity. The houses looked smaller than I remembered. Kids were still playing on the sidewalks, and a few of the older neighbors were still there. But that house, it looked abandoned. The paint had peeled almost completely off, and the windows were coated in grime. The mailbox was rusted again, hanging loosely from one screw. Grass had grown so high it was spilling over the sidewalk. I stood there for a while, just staring, and an old man from down the street stopped to talk to me. He told me that after we moved, nobody had lived there again. The house had been empty all that time. When I asked what happened to the family, he shrugged and said they just disappeared one day. No moving truck, no sign of leaving. One morning, the curtains were open for the first time and the house was empty inside. Furniture gone, no personal stuff left behind. The car was gone too. The neighbors called the police, but they never found any trace of the family. No records, no forwarding address, nothing. Just gone. That stuck with me. For weeks after hearing that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way they never spoke, never showed their faces. How everything about them seemed deliberately hidden. I still don't know who they were or what they were doing there. And maybe I never will. But sometimes when I think back to that night on Halloween, when those eyes looked out through the letterbox, I can still picture how still they were. Too still. Like they weren't curious or startled. Like they were waiting for something. And every now and then, I catch myself wondering if that house was ever really empty at all. I used to live alone in a small one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of an older building. The walls were thin enough that I could hear the pipes groan when my neighbors took showers, or when someone flushed a toilet late at night. It wasn't fancy or spacious, but it was mine. I had just turned 20, and this was the first place I could afford on my own after moving out of my parents' house. It wasn't in a dangerous area exactly, but it wasn't the safest either. The kind of place where you learned not to make eye contact with strangers in the hallway, and always double-check that your door was locked before bed. For the first few months, things were fine. I worked, came home, made dinner, and watched TV until I got sleepy. It was quiet most nights, except for the occasional noise from upstairs or someone arguing outside on the street. But then, sometime around my 4th month there, I started hearing something strange at night. It started as a faint scratching sound at my door. At first, I thought it was just the old building settling or maybe a mouse in the hallway. The sound came late, always after midnight when the building was silent and I was just about to fall asleep. It was a soft, uneven scratching, like someone running their fingernails lightly along the wood. I would freeze in bed and hold my breath, straining my ears. Sometimes it would stop for a few seconds and then start again, slow and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever it was knew I was listening. The first night I ignored it. The second night it happened again, this time lasting longer. I remember walking to the door quietly, standing still on the other side, and staring at it like I could somehow see through it. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I looked through the peephole but saw nothing but the dim yellow light of the hallway. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. I told myself it was probably a rat or some maintenance issue. But part of me knew better. The scratching kept happening over the next few nights, not every single night, but often enough to make me uneasy. I started leaving the TV on when I went to bed just so the sound wouldn't catch me off guard. The sound of voices, even fake ones, made me feel less alone. I even stuffed a towel at the bottom of the door once, like that could somehow protect me from whatever was out there. Then one night, instead of scratching, I heard knocking. 3 slow, heavy knocks. I froze instantly, sitting up in bed and staring at the door. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was right outside. I looked at the clock on my nightstand. 1:27 a.m. My first instinct was to pretend I wasn't home, but something made me get up anyway. I crept to the door, my feet barely making a sound against the carpet. I looked through the peephole, and what I saw made my stomach twist. A man was standing there wearing nothing but an open bathrobe. His chest and stomach were bare and his eyes were unfocused, like he was drunk or high or just not right in the head. He wasn't knocking anymore, just standing there staring at my door. His expression was strange, somewhere between a smile and a blank stare. He looked like he was waiting for me to open it. I didn't move. I just stood there staring through the peephole, barely breathing. After maybe 30 seconds, he lifted his hand and knocked again. 2 soft taps this time. Then he said something, but I couldn't hear it through the door. I didn't want to hear it. I backed away slowly until I reached my couch, sat down and waited. He stayed there for a while. I could see his shadow under the door. Eventually, I heard his footsteps fading down the hall. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every little noise made me jump. When the sun finally came up, I felt physically sick from exhaustion. I thought about telling the landlady, but what was I supposed to say? Some creepy guy in a robe was knocking on my door at 1 in the morning? She would probably think I was exaggerating. For a few days after that, things were quiet again. I tried to convince myself it was a one-time thing. Maybe he was drunk and went to the wrong apartment. Maybe it was just some neighbor I hadn't met yet. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Then a week later, I heard the scratching again. This time it was louder, more insistent. It woke me up instantly. The sound was right at the bottom of my door, slow and deliberate, like fingertips dragging along the wood. I sat up in bed listening. I didn't dare move. It went on for maybe a full minute, then stopped. I thought maybe he had left, but then came the knocking again, this time faster, harder. I felt cold all over. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole again. It was the same man, same bathrobe, only this time he looked angrier. His eyes were wide and he kept shifting his weight like he was impatient. He knocked again, louder, and I could see his mouth moving as if he was talking to me through the door. I couldn't make out the words, but it was enough to make my stomach twist in fear. I backed away from the door and grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely unlock it. I called the police. I didn't know what else to do. I told them there was a strange man outside my apartment trying to get in. The dispatcher said they would send someone right away. Those 10 minutes waiting for them to arrive felt like an hour. I could still hear the man outside pacing back and forth in front of my door. Every so often he would knock again, 3 times, then silence, then 2 more, like some twisted pattern. When I finally heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway and a man's voice shouting something authoritative, I almost started crying. The next thing I heard was a brief exchange, the sound of the stranger's voice, low and muffled, and then the sound of him being told to leave. After a few minutes, everything went quiet. I opened the door just a crack when the police knocked to check on me. They asked a few questions, took my name, and said they'd talk to the landlord about him. I didn't sleep that night either, but I felt a small sense of relief knowing someone else finally knew. The next morning, I went downstairs to talk to the landlady myself. She was already aware of the situation. Apparently, the man lived on the first floor, 2 doors down from the laundry room. She said he was a long-term tenant, but she'd had complaints about him before, mostly from women. I asked if there was anything she could do. She said she would talk to him directly, and that she'd make sure the police report was on file. That day, I noticed how different everything felt in the building. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the hallway made my skin crawl. Even though I hadn't seen him since the cops came, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me somehow. I started double-locking my door, even when I was just inside during the day. I kept my blinds closed and avoided using the shared laundry room altogether. Over the next few weeks, the noises stopped. No scratching, no knocking. I didn't see him in the hallways either. Part of me wondered if he'd been evicted or scared off. I started to relax a little, though I never really felt completely safe again in that apartment. Then one morning, maybe a month later, I was leaving for work when I saw him again. He was standing outside the building near the mailboxes, dressed normally this time, in jeans and a jacket. He looked up just as I came out. His eyes met mine for a split second and my stomach dropped. He didn't smile or say anything, just looked at me with that same blank, unnerving expression. I turned and walked the other way as quickly as I could. That was the last time I saw him. After that, he disappeared completely. I don't know if he moved out or if the landlady and the cops managed to get him to leave. All I know is that the scratching and the knocking stopped for good. Still, even after he was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It took me months to finally sleep without leaving the lights on. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed late at night, I still think I can hear faint scratching sounds somewhere in the building. Pipes maybe, or old wood settling. But every time, my heart skips a beat. I've since moved to a different apartment in another part of town, a newer place with thicker walls and better locks. But I'll never forget that sound, the slow, careful scratching at my door in the dark, and the image of that man standing there in his open bathrobe, waiting for me to answer. Even now, years later, I still check the peephole before opening my door, no matter who it is. I guess some habits never leave once fear teaches them to you. I still remember the summer the neighbors moved in across the street. I was in middle school then, maybe 12 or 13. Our neighborhood was one of those quiet, older places where every house looked like it had been standing there since the 60s. Most of the people knew each other by name, and things rarely ever changed. So when a moving truck showed up one morning in front of the old Miller house, the one that had been empty for nearly a year, everyone noticed. The new family seemed off, even from the start. I didn't understand why back then, but now looking back, there was something strange about the way they carried themselves. The man was tall and gaunt, always wearing long-sleeved shirts even in the summer heat. The woman had a sharp, bony face and short brown hair that looked like she cut it herself. They didn't smile much and they didn't really talk to anyone. The husband drove a beat-up old station wagon, and she was always seen carrying boxes in or out, sometimes late into the evening. They had 2 kids, both small, both quiet. I remember thinking they looked almost too quiet for kids their age. The younger one was probably around 4, with blonde hair that looked like it had been cut unevenly. The older one was maybe 6 or 7, dark hair, pale face, always following the younger one around. I never saw them playing like normal kids. They didn't ride bikes, didn't throw balls, didn't even seem to talk to each other much. Sometimes, from my window, I'd see them sitting on the porch steps just staring at the street like they were waiting for something. My parents said to leave them alone, that they were probably just shy or adjusting. Still, even at that age, I could feel something strange about that house. It always seemed a little too quiet. The windows were always closed, the curtains always drawn, even during the hottest days. Then one afternoon, maybe a few weeks after they moved in, the mother came over. I was sitting in the living room doing homework when I saw her through the window. She was standing at our front door, hands clasped together, waiting while my mom answered. I could hear her voice from where I sat, though not the words, just the tone. Nervous, apologetic. Later, my mom mentioned that the woman had come over to apologize because her kids were always screaming and crying. My mom just laughed and told her we hadn't heard anything, not once. And that's what made it strange, because it wasn't like our houses were far apart. If those kids were really screaming, we would have known. The walls between our homes were thin, sound carried easily across the street. But there had been nothing. No crying, no shouting, just that eerie silence. After that visit, I started paying more attention. I wanted to see what she was talking about. But the days passed and still there was nothing. Sometimes I'd sit by the window in the evenings pretending to read just to listen. The only sounds were crickets, dogs barking somewhere down the street, cars driving by. Not once did I hear those kids. Then, maybe a month or so later, something changed. I remember it was a Saturday because my dad was home, washing his car in the driveway. I was helping him, more or less just holding the hose while he did most of the work. It was late morning, already hot. Then out of nowhere, a scream tore through the quiet. It was the kind of scream that makes your stomach twist before your mind even catches up. My dad froze mid-swipe, soap dripping down the windshield. It was coming from across the street, from the neighbor's backyard. Without even thinking, he tossed the sponge aside and ran toward their house. I followed him halfway across the road before stopping. I was scared, though I didn't know why. The woman was in the backyard, her voice high and broken, yelling for help. My dad disappeared around the side of their house, and a few minutes later, I saw him reappear, running toward our home, his face pale. He told my mom to call the police. I remember standing there, holding the hose, watching the water spill onto the pavement, not knowing what to do. Within minutes, the quiet neighborhood exploded with noise. Sirens, cars pulling up, voices shouting. Police arrived, then paramedics. They rolled a small body out on a stretcher, covered it with a sheet. Even though no one said anything out loud, everyone knew. The younger child was dead. For the rest of the day, our street was swarming with people. Police cars lined the road, flashing lights bouncing off every house. There were men in suits, detectives, I guess, talking to the woman and her husband, walking around the backyard, taking pictures. I stood at my bedroom window for hours, just watching. It didn't feel real. Felt like something from a movie, not our quiet little street. At first, everyone thought it was some horrible accident. That's what people told themselves anyway. The rumor going around was that the kid had been playing and fell, hit his head on the patio. People were sad, shocked, but it still felt like an accident. Until it didn't. A few days later, more police showed up. Then unmarked cars, then vans. They taped off the whole property, even the sidewalk in front. The adults in the neighborhood were whispering, though they tried not to let us kids hear. But you can't really hide that kind of tension. Everyone knew something worse had come to light. I remember sitting at the dinner table one night, hearing my parents talk in low voices. My mom said she'd heard from one of the other neighbors that the woman was being questioned, that it wasn't looking good. The next morning, she was arrested. The truth came out slowly, piece by piece, but it was worse than anything I could have imagined. The kid hadn't fallen. She had beaten him so badly he died. Then she tried to make it look like an accident. For days after, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about that house across the street, about the quiet, about those kids who never made a sound, about the way the woman had come over to apologize for noise that never happened. I wondered if she had been testing us, trying to see if anyone could hear what went on behind those closed curtains. As the investigation went on, more details came out, things that made it even harder to wrap my head around. It turned out the family had moved from another town not too far away, and they'd left because they weren't welcome anymore. Neighbors there had reported them to Child Protective Services multiple times for suspected abuse. Apparently, there had been police visits, social workers, even court hearings, but somehow they always got out of it. They just packed up, moved, and started over somewhere new. The most horrifying part came last. The police found out the two kids weren't even legally adopted. They'd been bought. That's the word people used. Bought, not taken in, not fostered, purchased. Like they were things, not children. It was the 1980s, before the internet, before you could look people up in seconds. Back then, you could move 2 towns over, and no one would know who you were or what you'd done. They'd only lived across from us for a few months before it all fell apart. After the arrests, the house sat empty again. For a long time, no one wanted to go near it. Even the real estate agent couldn't sell it. The grass grew tall, the paint started peeling. Every time I walked past it on my way to school, I'd get this strange feeling, like the air around it was heavier somehow. Sometimes late at night, I'd look out my window across the street. The house was dark, the curtains still drawn even though no one lived there anymore. The police had taken down the tape weeks ago, but it still felt like a crime scene. I think about the little boy, how he must have felt. About the quiet, the way no one heard him. And about how close it all was. How just a few steps away from where I slept, something terrible had been happening all along. Eventually, another family moved in, years later. They repainted the house, fixed the yard, tried to make it normal again. But for me, it never was. Even now, I can still picture that summer clearly. The heat, the sound of sirens, the sight of police tape fluttering in the wind. That was the first time I realized that monsters don't look like monsters. They look like neighbors. They wave, they mow their lawns, they carry groceries into their homes. And behind closed doors, they do things no one wants to believe are possible. Every time I think about that woman coming over to apologize for her kids screaming, I get this cold feeling in my chest. 'Cause I know now that she wasn't apologizing for something we heard. She was apologizing because she knew we didn't. I live out in the country, a stretch of road that winds between fields and woods, the kind of place where people keep to themselves. There are only a handful of houses scattered along the road, and most of us have a few acres of space in between. It's quiet, and that's the way I've always liked it. You can hear the wind move through the trees or a distant tractor, but mostly it's still. Peaceful, at least it used to be. My nearest neighbor is an old man who lives about a 3-minute drive down the road. I don't even know exactly how old he is. Maybe in his 70s, maybe older. He's the kind of man who always looks half-bent from working too many years outside. When I first moved in, I thought he was just one of those overly curious country folks. Friendly, but nosy. I didn't know how deep his weirdness went until he started showing up too often. in ways that made my skin crawl. It started with the mail. Out here, the mailboxes are all grouped together at one spot on the roadside, because the postal driver doesn't want to make long stops down every driveway. My box was right next to his, just an old metal one on a wooden post. One day I noticed that my magazines were arriving already opened. At first I thought maybe it was the wind, or the flap wasn't closing right. Then I started noticing pages slightly bent, like someone had flipped through them. A week later, I came home from work and found a few envelopes wedged between my screen door and the frame. They were my bills, and I knew they should have been inside the mailbox, not at my door. A sticky note was attached that said something like, "Mail was left open, I brought it up for you." No name. But I knew who it was. The old man had that habit, walking up uninvited. I tried to brush it off. Told myself maybe he was just trying to help. Maybe he thought he was being a good neighbor. But when I started noticing certain things missing, it got harder to ignore. I subscribed to a few magazines, mostly car stuff and outdoors ones. They started vanishing. I'd wait for an issue I was looking forward to and it just wouldn't come. Then about 2 days later it'd be sitting in my box again, crinkled at the edges like someone had been reading it in bed. One morning I went to check the mail and saw him standing there, holding a handful of letters. Mine. He looked startled when he saw me, like I'd caught him doing something he shouldn't. He muttered something about how the mail carrier mixed them up. But I noticed that all my mail had my name printed clearly in bold letters. There was no mistaking whose it was. That was the day I decided to buy a locking mailbox. I drove into town, picked out a heavy steel one that bolted to the post and installed it myself that evening. It looked sturdy and clean, with a small key slot under the lid. The next morning, I found the mailbox tipped over, face down in the gravel. The post was still standing, but the screws had been ripped clean out. I hadn't heard a thing during the night. Not long after, the old man came driving up my driveway in a panic. I was standing on the porch looking at the damage when his truck rolled in, gravel crunching under the tires. He climbed out fast, moving quicker than I'd ever seen him move before. His voice was shaky, almost too concerned. He said something about how locking mailboxes are too heavy, that they can't handle the wind, that I needed to go back to a regular one. The way he said it, urgent, almost pleading, made it clear that he wasn't talking about the weight. He was upset that he couldn't get inside it anymore. That was enough for me. I called the sheriff that afternoon. They sent a deputy who came by and listened while I explained everything. He nodded a lot but didn't write much down. He said that since the mailbox wasn't technically destroyed, there wasn't much they could do unless I caught him in the act. Still, just the fact that I made a report must have spooked the old man, because a few days later he got himself a brand new mailbox installed right in front of his own driveway. For a while after that, things went quiet. I'd see him drive by sometimes, slowing down near my gate, but he never stopped. I started to think maybe it was over. Maybe he'd gotten the message. But then he found another way to dig into my life. I started noticing that my recycling bin was sometimes slightly moved from where I'd left it. Nothing major, just a few inches off to the side. Then one day, I came home to find the lid open and several bottles sitting on top instead of inside. It was subtle, but it was clear someone had gone through it. I could almost see the scene in my head. Him rummaging around, pulling out empty bottles, judging. The funny thing is, I barely drink. I might have a couple beers now and then. And when I finally take the recycling out, it looks like I've had a small party because it's built up for months. But one afternoon I saw him standing by the road, and when I drove past he gave me this look, half smug, half disappointed. That's when I realized he thought he'd caught me in some secret bad habit, like I was some kind of drunk living next door to him. It was creepy in a quiet, lingering way. You start to feel like every move you make is being watched. Every sound outside your house at night could be him wandering around. I started keeping the blinds down more often, and I made sure the motion light by my front porch stayed on all night. I even bought a small camera and set it up near the driveway, pointing toward the mailbox and the road. For a few weeks it stayed calm again. Didn't see him much except occasionally driving by slowly. like he wanted to remind me that he was still around. Then one afternoon, he came walking up my driveway again. I didn't even see him coming until he was almost at the porch. He started talking about how my gutters were clogged, saying the rainwater would cause rot if I didn't clean them soon. I just stood there, trying to keep my voice steady, and told him to get off my property.
That was the first time I snapped.
I told him not to come over ever again, not for any reason. I meant it. He didn't argue. He just stared for a second, his face blank but his eyes sharp. Then he turned and walked back down the driveway to his truck. I thought that was the end of it. But a few days later I saw his truck again. He stopped halfway down my driveway, rolled down his window and said something about waiting for an invite, like we were supposed to have him and his wife over for dinner. That was the moment I felt it shift from weird to something darker. He wasn't just nosy or eccentric. He was testing how far he could go. The more I tried to push him back, the more he pushed against that boundary. After that, I started locking everything, even during the day. I made sure my back gate stayed chained. I stopped taking the trash out at night and waited until morning. The mailbox camera caught him once, his truck stopping briefly, lights off, then rolling forward again. Not long enough to do anything, just enough to let me know he was still watching. There's a particular kind of fear that doesn't come from loud noises or sudden scares. It's the kind that builds slowly, the kind that follows you even when nothing's happening. It's lying in bed at night, hearing a car engine hum faintly in the distance and wondering if it's his. It's waking up in the morning and checking the locks before you even make coffee. I haven't spoken to him since that day. I don't wave when he drives by. I don't acknowledge him at all. And yet sometimes I'll find little signs that he's still around. Footprints near the ditch after it rains, or the sound of gravel crunching just a bit too close to the end of my driveway when it's dark. The sheriff's office said there's not much they can do unless he trespasses again. So I wait. I've got cameras now, lights, locks, everything I can think of. But sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, hearing the faint sound of tires on gravel, and I just lie there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to fade. I moved to the country for peace and quiet, to get away from people and the noise of the city. But now, every time the wind moves through the trees or a car passes in the distance, I wonder if he's out there, watching, waiting for another chance to cross that line. And the worst part is, I know he will eventually. People like him don't stop. They just wait until they think you've stopped paying attention. So I keep watching too. Every day, every night. Because out here, in the dark stretches between houses, no one really knows what their neighbor is capable of. I still remember the night I woke up to the flashing red and blue lights cutting through my blinds. At first, I didn't even know what time it was. The glow of those lights pulsed against my walls in steady intervals, and I could hear the faint hum of a running engine somewhere outside. It was quiet in the house except for that low, muffled sound coming from outside, so I got up and looked through my bedroom window. Across the street there was a squad car parked halfway on the lawn of my next-door neighbor's place. The lights reflected off the hood of his red Corvette like it was part of the scene, bright flashes dancing across its polished surface. The car always looked freshly waxed, like he took care of it more than anything else he owned. For a second I thought someone must have tried to steal it. It wasn't hard to imagine. Nice car, dark street, quiet neighborhood. Figured maybe the police had caught whoever was doing it. I stood there watching for a minute. There were two officers, their flashlights moving across the driveway, one of them shining it briefly into the open garage. The door was up and I could see the clutter inside, boxes, tools, some old furniture. Nothing really seemed out of place, but something about how still it was made me uneasy. The flashing lights didn't stop, and neither officer was talking. No shouting, no commands. Just silence and light. After a while, I got tired of watching. I didn't see any movement beyond that, and I told myself it wasn't my business. I went back to bed. I remember laying there, eyes closed, and the glow from those lights still seeped through the cracks in my blinds. It flickered on my ceiling until I finally drifted off again. The next morning, the street looked normal again. The squad car was gone. The Corvette was still sitting in the driveway, exactly how it had been before. I was halfway through my coffee when one of the neighbors down the street, a woman who always walked her dog early, stopped by my mailbox and waved. She asked if I knew what had happened last night. I told her I didn't know for sure, but I guessed maybe someone had tried to steal the car. She looked at me strangely for a second, like I'd said something stupid. Then she told me it wasn't a theft, that the neighbor's girlfriend had committed suicide in the house. I didn't even know he had a girlfriend. The man kept to himself mostly. I'd see him out front washing that car every weekend, sometimes polishing the wheels, but never anyone else around. I didn't know her name, didn't even know what she looked like. The idea that she had died there just didn't fit with the image I had of that house. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say much. We stood there for a few seconds while her dog sniffed the grass, and then she moved on. I went back inside and looked out my window again. Everything seemed the same. The Corvette was still parked there, clean as always. The blinds on his windows were drawn. Nothing about the place looked different, but knowing what I knew now made it feel strange. The air felt heavier somehow. Later that afternoon, when I stepped outside to bring in the trash cans, I noticed something that hadn't been there earlier. Out on his lawn near the side of the driveway, there was a couch. It looked like it had been dragged out of the house. Faded brown fabric, cushions slightly sunken in. At first I didn't think much of it. People put furniture out all the time when they're cleaning or getting rid of stuff. But as I looked closer, I noticed a dark stain on one of the seat cushions. It wasn't huge, but it was large enough to notice from a few feet away. The kind of stain that soaked deep into the fabric. It looked like old blood. I didn't want to believe that's what it was, but there was no mistaking the shape, the uneven edge of it. The couch sat there like that for days. No one touched it. Not the man, not the garbage crew, not even the wind seemed to bother it. It just sat there under the sun, and after a while the smell started to get noticeable when you walked past. I didn't see my neighbor much after that. A few times I noticed him outside late at night, standing near the Corvette, smoking, staring off toward the road. He always looked distant, like he wasn't really there. His hair started to look messier, his clothes less put together. He used to be meticulous about how he looked, just like his car, but after that night, everything about him changed. One morning, the Corvette was gone. I didn't see it drive off, just noticed it wasn't there anymore. Then, a few days later, the house went dark. No lights on at night, no movement inside. A real estate sign went up a week later. The couch was still there even after he left. It finally disappeared after about a month, hauled away by someone who didn't seem to care what it was or where it had come from. The house sat empty for a long time after that. The grass grew tall. Paint on the window trim started to chip. Every now and then, I'd see a car pull into the driveway, stay for a few minutes, and then leave again. Maybe people were looking to buy it, maybe not. No one ever stayed long. Years went by, and the memory of that night started to fade. I stopped thinking about it much. Life moved on, neighbors came and went, the street changed little by little. The house eventually got new owners. A quiet couple who didn't talk much but kept the place clean. The Corvette never came back, and no one really mentioned the man again. Then one evening there was a knock at our door. I opened it to find a man standing there in a gray suit. He introduced himself as someone from the district attorney's office. I could tell right away he wasn't just making casual conversation. He had that serious, measured way of speaking that made you pay attention. He asked if we had been friends with the man who used to live next door. I told him no. We'd only just moved into the neighborhood when all that happened. We didn't really know him beyond seeing him outside working on his car. I said, "You're talking about the guy whose girlfriend committed suicide, right?" He nodded slightly, but then his expression changed. He paused for a second, looked toward the house next door, and said it definitely wasn't suicide. That's all he said before leaving. After he left, I sat there for a while, just thinking about it. All those years, I'd never questioned what I was told. I assumed the story was simple, tragic but simple. But now I started to replay everything in my mind. The flashing lights that night, how quiet it had been. No ambulance siren, no paramedics rushing around. The way the couch appeared outside the next day. Not covered or hidden, just sitting there for everyone to see. I realized that the night the police came, I hadn't seen anyone taken away. No one had left in handcuffs, but no one had left in a stretcher either. Just flashing lights and silence. Maybe that silence had meant something. Maybe the officers were being careful not to disturb anything. Maybe they already knew what had happened, or suspected something worse. The thought bothered me for weeks. I'd sit out on my porch at night and look toward that house. I'd imagine what had gone on behind those blinds. How long she'd been there before anyone called the police. What really happened inside that living room before the couch ended up outside. Eventually, I stopped trying to piece it together. Some things you just never get the full truth about. But every once in a while, usually late at night when I see police lights flicker down the street for something unrelated, I think back to that night. The Corvette shining red and blue, the quiet of the street, the way I went back to bed thinking it was just some petty crime. Now I know better than to assume what's happening when the lights come. Sometimes the worst things don't make a sound.